Hi folks, welcome to part 2 of our book club on Julius Evola's Revolt Against the Modern World. I'm joined by Stelios.
Hello.
And in part 1 we covered the first half of the book, which is him, it's called The World of Tradition. It's him laying out the metaphysics of the traditional pre-Christian classical pagan world. And I thought that was very interesting. And part 2 is called The Genesis and Face of the Modern World. And in part 2 he explains how tradition has been supplanted and how it is causing a spiritual and material degradation of the world until we reach the bottom of the Dark Age. There's the full collapse, and we are reborn into the Golden Age again.
So it's not a point of no return. Is that there is a
no? Well, that's the point.
Yeah.
Is it unlike the sort of Whig version of history, where history is a straight line?
Yeah.
For him, history is a series of cycles. And each one begins and has a close. And then a new cycle begins. And the cycles are sort of a cycle of cycles.
Okay.
And so we go through the Golden Age cycle, the Silver Age cycle, the Bronze Age cycle, the Iron Age cycle, and then back to the Golden Age cycle. So history is a
pattern.
Yes, it's a predictable thing. And we see this in the meme of, the strong men create good times create weak men create hard times create strong men.
Yeah.
It rings true because there probably is some truth to it.
I think there's considerable wisdom in it.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is. And so in this part, in the second half, he says that he plans to lay out the dynamic and unfolding of the traditional and anti-traditional forces in history, rather than giving a methodological exploration into the world of tradition. He wants to understand the sort of predominating factors that lead these cycles to the next ones. And so he begins by explaining the 4 ages of man. Now, these are expressly from Greek mythology, but the thing is, all mythologies seem to have this sort of cyclical view of the world. They are, of course, the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age, and he maps onto these his metaphysical analysis.
Yeah, I don't think it was just in the Greek mythology. I think it was also in the Bhagavad Gita.
It's in almost all of them, but it's the naming convention he's taken from the Greek one.
Yes.
And so we might think of the most distant past as being cavemen banging rocks together, right? But that's not how he views it. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that he's not talking about levels of material comfort or technological expertise. Right?
Yeah.
He is speaking on a purely spiritual plane. So what he's saying is, in the Golden Age, mankind lived in the most heroic tradition and as close to the most heroic tradition. And it's interesting how this is actually completely compatible with mankind being cavemen. Right, because if you are literally, the leader of a savage tribe, and you have to be as masculine as possible to fend off lions and whatnot. You have to be the conquering hero that becomes the myth and legend that becomes Hercules or Gilgamesh or whatever. And it's actually strangely compatible with technological development, and it's interesting because that renders technological development a kind of handicap to the authentic human experience, which leads us into the Iron Age, where everything is purely materialistic, but I'll get into that later. And so in the Golden Age, you have stories of heroes, because you don't have history, you have legends. So you have Gilgamesh, you have Hercules, you have, every culture has one of these great heroes. And it's probable that it just represents, at some point in time, just some guy who is really strong. Is really capable. The legend spins out of control. But Evola also points out that, look, if you've got history, you've got mythology, and they're tracking, and at one point history breaks away from mythology, the history is wrong. Okay? Don't worry about that. The mythology is what's important here. Okay. And I think he's right on that. So I'm going to continue with that sort of line of thinking for this podcast. But he says that the fall of the Golden Age begins when the divine race of gods begin breeding with the human stock. So this is like the Nephilim, the angels, producing the giants in the earth. And he argues that if we in the modern era represent the sort of final stages of a devolved humanity. And I mean, if we look at testosterone levels.
Okay. I mean, he has a point.
Is he wrong?
He has a point. I mean,
Look
I
at
don't
modern
think
men.
we can deny this.
It's just one of those things where it's like literally all of this just like, well, I mean, he does have a point, right? It's quite specific and like it's very general. It's a specific layer that's very broad, and so there are lots of ways to attack it. But if you stand back, but you go, yeah, okay, he's not wrong. That you could argue that there's a more authentic humanity in being in a primitive culture, right? You could definitely argue that they are more manly than your average soy boy who's protesting for trans rights.
Okay, so there's a big question here. That, as I've said, I haven't read the book. I'm just trying to understand what I hear, the way you phrase it. So before you mentioned that you're not talking about the past, Evola thinking that the past was a golden age in a material sense, but in a moral sense.
Yeah, in a transcendent sense. So there is the transcendental world that we incarnate into the real world through our actions, and in the golden era, we were living this and incarnating it authentically, right? This imminent transcendence where we were connected to the divine, whether it was on a mammoth hunt or whatever it was, conducting some strange ritual, and as the modern era has arrived, we've totally lost all of that. And so there's this connection, this bridge between the two worlds has been severed, and that leaves us...
Okay, but the question I want to raise is that whether it's how to understand masculinity. Because I think that essentially this is what is essential here.
Well, as we talked about last time, masculinity is the heroic, domineering, conquering solar archetype. Okay,
but the question is whether this is too materialistic and leaves the transcendent away. So why? So, for instance, when we say today, okay, we are a bit more, let's say, effeminate, or we don't have the Gilgamesh physique. We are not that manly in a physical sense, but still, that doesn't mean that we are not courageous in a moral sense.
That's true, but this is, it's more about, it's not so much how you look. How you look is merely a consequence of what you do.
Yeah.
And the actions themselves are what are important. The actions are taking the risks, overcoming the monsters, conquering the problem, and setting the order of the universe, right? That's the important thing. It's setting a masculine order of the universe. And I'll tell you what, if there's one thing you can't say about modern society is it's got a masculine order, right? The energy is very distinctly feminine and aphrodisiac of Aphrodite. I don't know.
You mean that there's a promiscuity?
Oh, yes.
An atmosphere of promiscuity.
Yes.
And licentiousness.
Yes, very much. And so the opposite of this would be the masculine and restrained order of the cosmos. And so going into the next chapter there is the Golden Age, right? And this is where man lived as close to tradition as possible in the heroic masculine form. And so during this age, mortal people lived as though they were gods, and then no miserable old age happened to them. And this is very similar to Rousseau's view of the savage man, actually, where he says in the Social Contract, well, look, man just was forever a child, essentially. The race was old, but man himself was forever a child. And he passed without anyone noticing, barely even noticing himself. It's very similar sort of harmonization of views.
Yeah.
But and they both very much worship and appreciate this aspect of humanity, like living like this, but for very different reasons.
But there's a question here that I want to ask, is that whether... So if he thinks that this is a pattern that necessarily unfolds, why say that the past was a golden age and not say that, well, the past is an infinite cycle which manifests a pattern which had both golden ages, bronze ages, iron ages? Why cherry pick?
You could do that, but what he's really just beginning at the beginning of the cycle. Right? Okay. So at some point, man, he lives in his golden age, and then the cycle pursues. But he would agree that, this has doubtless happened many times throughout the past and will doubtless happen many times into the future. Okay. This is the cycle of human life that we are talking about. So there's no getting away from it. Everyone is on the wheel, as it were. But he says, he thinks that tradition holds that the civilization of the Golden Age came from the northern Arctic regions of the world. And this is the hyperborean race. Remember, he's writing the beginning of the 20th century where they use strange language to describe this.
That's Nietzschean, I think.
Very well. It's just a common sort of milieu that they were living in. In sort of 1900, it was common for them to use terms like this, and they thought in these ways. But this hyperborean race was the progenitor of the solar principle. So it was the northern stock who lived closest to the Arctic Circle, and this pole was obsessed with the sun because, of course, they got the least of it, and so they were particularly concerned about this. And it's interesting how he ties the hardship of where they lived to the transcendental traditions they followed, right? Because the people of the South, as we'll get to in a bit, were very different. Yeah. And they were very much of the earth rather than being of the sun. And so he views these as two competing, he says poles, but what he means is axes that life revolves around.
So does he think that it is the condition of mankind to have lived in a golden age like that, or the condition of the Hyperboreans?
The condition of the Hyperboreans.
Okay. And he was an Italian in the south?
Yes. Okay. From Sicily. So
okay,
he definitely, he's not being ethnically particular about this. And he speaks very highly of the Germanic people, actually, not being one himself. Right. So he goes on to talk about the pole and the Hyperborean region, which, was where the Hyperboreans came from. And he says that actually what happened was a natural disaster, some kind of freezing. The long night descended in the polar region, and this caused a forced migration of the northern peoples down to the south.
Something like an ice age.
Yeah, something like an ice age. And this is when the first cycle comes to an end, and a new cycle, which is the Atlantic cycle, began. Very interesting. I mean, I don't think historically any of this is true. Yeah. But I mean, there probably is something to it. Like, we're not sure exactly where the Germanic people came from, but it could be that they've come from Scandinavia or something like that, or they migrated up there. Who knows? I don't know. Right, but there is a distinction between the sort of northern Germanic Europeans and the southern Mediterranean Europeans. Yeah, so, but he says, ever since the polar seat became deserted, it is possible to verify that progressive alternation and loss of the original tradition that will eventually lead to the Iron Age, or the Kali Yuga, the era of the wolf, and strictly speaking to modern times. So this is all a sort of continual thing for him. But the environment was what forced them to live as close to tradition as possible, in his view. And it's close to the solar masculine tradition as well, of heroism, rather than the telluric feminine tradition of decadence. Lots of moral judgments being made by Evola in this. So this migration from the polar seat, because of the descent of the Ice Age, presumably, leads to what he calls the Northern Atlantic cycle, which is the Silver Age. Now, the Silver Age is not just dominated by a different landscape, it's dominated by a different moral paradigm. And so he believes there were two great waves of migration, first moving north to south, then west to east. So in Western Europe, say sort of France, Spain region, that sort of area, is where the Atlantic seat was of civilization was located to. And this presumably corresponds to Atlantis, as described by Plato.
Okay. In the Critias, I think.
Yes, that's correct. And remember, where history disagrees with mythology, history is wrong. And so, along with the migration, a bunch of traditional symbols, names, and languages were carried and became transposed over other geographic features. From the Atlantic seat, the northern race spread to the Americas and to Europe, as is recorded by the myths and legends of these places. And Evola believes that these were what we would call in the modern era, or in his day, Cro-Magnon man, he believed were superior to the other kinds of humans that existed there previously. So I'm not even sure this is Homo sapiens sapiens that he's talking about. This is supposed to mean how far back this is supposed to have gone.
Sorry, but in a weird way, it reminds me of some myths in Plato. Yeah. I think there is a myth like that in the Protagoras.
Yeah, he's drawing
talking
from all
about
of this.
how people were created by clay.
Yeah,
and I think he specifically refers to a golden age and governed by Kronos.
Yep.
And then Zeus is supposed to have...
Yeah, we'll get to Zeus. Zeus comes about in the Bronze Age, you see.
Yeah.
But anyway, so the Age of Atlantis is the Silver Age. And in the Silver Age, you have a feminine principle that is ruling over society. But it is not the Aphroditean feminine principle, which is decadent. It is the Demetrian feminine principle. So is the purity of the mother.
Which is linked with the earth and living from the earth.
It is. He expressly, we'll get to him in a minute, in fact, I think. But he expressly says that there's a kind of mixture of the civilization of the heroic father and the pure mother in the Silver Age, where these two values are in competition with one another. But the northern Atlantic cycle comes to an end in a great flood, which is well attested in mythology. Water again. Yeah. Well attested in mythology, apparently. Well, definitely, in fact. And so this is the end of like the genuinely sort of prehistoric era of this cycle.
The myth of the flood again, that is constantly being
absolutely. It's constantly comes up. And so he then goes on to an examination of the north and south poles, and these are the two poles of civilization that Evola believes to be at odds with one another. So the Golden Age was the pure focus on the northern pole, which he describes as Olympian and dedicates to the hyperborean god Apollo. And the Silver Age is a mingling of the two poles. The southern pole, which is, of course, feminine, dark, of the earth, debauched. And
he had women issues.
Well, I mean, if you call it an issue.
Okay.
He certainly had his opinions. He describes his favorite hero as Hercules for being famously anti-gynocratic. Don't put women in charge is Evola's view, right? Yeah. So anyway, the Silver Age therefore was a sort of mingling of the northern and southern poles, right? And this isn't a day-night cycle, as it might be easy to interpret it, but it instead represents a competition of values, right? And so he says that wherever the Golden Age is under the aegis of the sun, so pure light and spiritual virility, you get the universe revolving around a fixed point, and the Silver Age is under the aegis of the water or the moon, and all the source of all energy is therefore more flexible and more fluid, and it's not the sort of masculine strength that's holding the universe in place. It's adapting to chaos and changing conditions.
And do you think that there is an analogy there with not holding lines, trying to retreat, whether it's from actual combat or from combat of other types?
Whether it's social standards, maybe, things like that. Absolutely. Yeah. Like the heroic masculine principle, the solar principle, it's meant to be fixed in place by force and willpower, basically. Yeah. And retreating from these things leads you inevitably into the feminine principles.
So he sort of says that the masculine principle is the orderly one.
Yes.
And the less masculine we become, the more this order disintegrates and the more disorderly society is.
Exactly. That's exactly the problem. The introduction of the feminine principle is the beginning of the downfall of the civilization. And this happens all the time, right? So he carries on and says, look, so you can map this onto history. So you can look at Neolithic idols, and they're almost all fat, pregnant women. These very, very feminine. You got the sort of Minoan civilization, which is very feminine, frankly. And this difference comes about specifically, he says, because of their environments. He says the experience of the sun, of light, and of fire itself naturally acted in the northern races as a liberating spirituality, especially during the long glacial winter.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.